In this video, I'm going to finish the refactoring of a PDF and web scraping script. If you haven't watched part 1 of this refactoring, I've put a link to that video in the description of this one. Now, I'm not a data scientist myself. I'm a software engineer or software designer. So I view projects like these through the lens of a software engineer. If you want to learn more about data science itself, Skillshare, who's the sponsor of this video, has a couple of great classes to get you started. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creators. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. Skillshare has many classes on web development, programming in Python, software engineering, and software design. At the moment, I'm following Frank Kane's course on data science and machine learning with Python. It's really comprehensive. It contains lessons about statistics, data types, clustering algorithms, decision trees, it covers libraries such as pandas, basically everything you need to know in order to get started. Skillshare is curated for learning. There are no ads and they're always launching new premium classes, so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. The project I'm refactoring is a script that scrapes data from websites, PDF files. In particular, it looks at academic papers and extracts research keywords and word frequencies. The state that we ended up with after the last part is that we have a main file that contains configuration settings. I didn't really change anything there. We have a couple of classes for handling different scrape requests. And what I mentioned last time is that the ScrapeRequest class has a very weird mechanism of instantiating subclasses itself, which we need to fix. So there's a ScrapeRequest generic class, and then we have Sci-Hub Scrape. We have a JSON Scrape class, and we had a PDF scraper, which I moved in the last video to a separate file and I cleaned up completely. So that PDF scraper now is a pretty short class. It has a single method called scrape, and it has a couple of helpful methods for guessing the DOI, computing filter tokens depending on stop words, etc., and a most common words helper function, and it uses those functions to produce the scrape result. And the result of a scrape, that's actually a definition we added here. It's a data class and it contains a couple of fields. Now, next to these scrapers, we have a couple of helper functions here, like for changing a directory. And there is also a couple of different FileRequest classes, which are actually not really all FileRequest, but that basically follows the same structure as the ScrapeRequest, where the superclass is itself creating instances of its own subclasses, which is not a good idea, like I mentioned in the previous video. Now, the reason these classes are still here is that we still have a DOI request class and we have a PopID request class. For fetching the data from the PDF files, I created a simple function, fetch terms from PDF files, that solved this, and then we no longer need that class. So we need to do the same thing for the other two, for DOI and for the PopID request classes. And then after that, we can remove this FileRequest class because that's no longer needed. In this part of the refactoring, I'm going to clean up the scraper classes and move a few more things to different files. And then I'm going to show you how to properly deal with configuration settings in this project. Let's dive in. As you can see, the DOI request class, it creates a scraper depending on a lookup key that you give it. So basically the way that scrapers and DOI request instances are related to each other is via these lookup codes. And that's generally not a very nice thing to do because you're basically re-implementing the composition mechanism. There's a much simpler way to do it by just using composition. What we can do instead is not create a class like this, but simply create a function, fetch terms from DOI, and pass a scraper instance to that function so that we know, okay, that's the particular scraper that this is going to use. But in order to do that, we need a more generic representation of what a scraper is. And we have one, which is the one here in the main file called ScrapeRequest, but that doesn't really apply here because this is not a generic representation. This is responsible for creating instances. So instead of this, what I'm going to do is I'll go and into the scraper file, and let's add a scraper protocol class here that then the other parts of the code rely on. The scraper protocol class is actually really simple. Let's say we have a class scraper, which is a protocol, and this only has one method. Now in the main file, we had ScrapeRequest subclass that had a download method, but the name download is not very clear because it's not always downloading something. So I'm just going to use the scrape name for this particular method. And what this needs is, let's look back into the main file. We see that it needs a search text. So that's all our scraper class is. And actually the scrape method also returns a result, which is a scrape result. So then this is our scraper protocol class. And now let's go back into the main file. And what we're going to do first is go to these different classes, DOI request and pub ID request. And let's turn these into functions as well. So I'm going to start with the DOI request class. And I'll put them here in the fetch file because that's also where we have the version for the PDF files. And then basically what we'll have is this function. And let's call this function fetch terms from DOI. And this is going to get a target, which is a string, and it's going to get a scraper, which is of type scraper. And scraper we need to import. Now remove the self.references here. Also here, you see that all the variables that should actually be local are stored in instance variables, so we don't need to do that. So this constructs the search terms. And then it should do scraper.scrape, because that's the new interface that we defined. So that means this is what we get. And then we can remove the rest of this class. There's a couple of typing errors here. Part of the problem is that TQDM, which is responsible for showing those progress bars, is not really dealing with typing properly. So search term, for example, it's unknown. So that basically feeds back into that the scrape function or the scrape method now also gets an unknown thing, which results in another type error, etc., etc. I'm not going to fix that in this video, but I hope some of these libraries will catch up with the typing system in Python, and this is going to look a lot cleaner. So that's fetch terms from DOI. And now I'll go back in the main file. That means that this class, I can delete this. And we can do the same for the pub ID request. So I'm also going to copy this class to the fetch.py file. There we go. And this method is going to become fetch terms from pub ID. If you look at the pub ID request, that actually takes a data frame. So here the target is going to be a pandas data frame. And this obviously also needs a scraper, just like the other fetch functions. And now let's remove all the self references anymore that are no longer needed. And this should be scrape, obviously. Like so. And you see that search terms here is a tuple actually containing all the search texts, and then it's converted into a list. And that actually leads to problems because now in order to use it here, we need to convert it into a list. And there's actually no reason to do it because here it's also a list. So we should make sure that this is consistent. So let's change this into a list as well. Like so. And now it means we don't need to convert it to a list here anymore. And then this self we should also still delete. So this is our fetch terms from pub ID, and then the remaining bits of this class can be removed because that's no longer needed. There we go. And again, as you see, there is a couple of typing issues here. I'm not going to look into it in this video. And on the main file, I can remove the pub ID request class because that's now a simple function. And that means that the FileRequest class can now also be deleted. Now this already makes the main file a lot shorter. There's a couple of things left to clean up. One thing is that we have this ScrapeRequest class and the sci-hub scrape and the JSON scrape classes. So these ones we can also put into a separate file and remove this dependency on the ScrapeRequest superclass because we're not going to need that mechanism anymore. So what I'll do is I create two files here, a JSON PI file and a sci-hub PI file. And that's where I'm going to put these two classes. So let's start with the JSON scraper. So I'll select all the code in class. And I'll move it over here. Now also here there are things you can do similar to what I did with the PDF scraper, in that there are keys in here. Maybe you want to extract them and define them in a separate constant. There's this get data entry method. Everything is also here stored into instance variables, which is not needed. So you can also clean this up in a similar way to the PDF scraper. I won't do that in this video because it's mostly the same work that I also did in the PDF scraper class. But optimally, that's what you'd want to do here as well. So the JSON scraper. So that's no longer a subclass of ScrapeRequest. So I'm just going to remove all of this. And the JSON scrape is going to have a scrape method as well, and that will return a scrape result. And let's import that here. There we go. And there's a couple of other imports missing. Let me copy them from here. There, that looks already a lot better. And now you see that there are a couple of issues that start to appear. For example, here we have a base URL, which is a configuration setting in the main file, right? That's defined here. Now, one way to fix it is basically define it inside the json.py file. That's not a very good solution, because then your configuration settings become really hard to find. So I won't fix this just yet, but later on in the video, when I start looking at the configuration, I'm going to show you how you can fix this in a neat way. So other than that, I'm going to leave the class as is for the moment, and I'm going to do the same with the Sci-Hub class. So that's this one. Let's remove it here. Go into the Sci-Hub file and paste it here. And here you see we have a similar problem in that we also have a constant here that we rely on, but we don't have access to that constant in this file. So I'm going to look more closely at that when I deal with the configuration settings. So this method is then also called scrape, and this is also going to return a scrape result. We no longer need this. Let's add missing imports. There we go. And this import we're also going to need, like so. Now this already looks a lot cleaner. Also here we get a lot of type errors, and I think there's also a lot to improve in this class. But since it's very similar to what I did in the PDF scraper, I'm just going to skip this for this video. Now back to the main file. What remains here? So we have our configs. We have the ScrapeRequest class, which I'm now going to delete, which feels great. I love deleting this class. Very nice. All right, bye-bye. We don't need that anymore. And then let's see what we still have. We have a utility function for changing a directory, and we have an export function, which will probably also be better if we move this to a separate file as well. So let's create two more files here. Export.js. That's the wrong channel. Export.py. And this is going to contain the export function that is defined here. There we go. And there's a couple of missing imports, obviously. So let's copy this to this file and let's remove the ones we don't need. So also here you see that we need parameters. In this case, it makes most sense to define this export dir as a parameter to this function. So let's insert it here. And that's going to be a string, the export dir. Now the only thing that's missing is the date and the change dir function, which will import from another file. Let's call that dir.py. Going back into the main file, let's copy this here. There we go. And this is going to need a couple of OS imports. So let's add the import here. It also needs context manager. So let's put that here as well. There's actually a slight issue in this function, is that in the try catch block, it retrieves the current working directory. And then finally it changes to that working directory. But this can potentially lead to a bug, because if this part of the code fails, if this raises an error, then the finally part cannot be properly executed because this command was not executed. So in this case, it's better to put this command right here and delete it here. And that also solves the error that we saw here in the finally part. There's always something to be aware of when you're dealing with exceptions. Is all the data available everywhere, and is it valid? And in this case, it's better to put this here because the destination part, the line that came before it, doesn't rely on the current working directory. So we can actually solve it really easily, and this just increases the stability of the code. And this is also why it's so important to use supporting tools for type checking, for linting your code, to make sure that these kind of small issues don't become bigger problems in the future. So that's the change dir function. Let me close this file because we're not going to change that anymore. And then here, let's import this from, oh, now it's importing from main. That was not the idea. I want to import it from scrape.dir. There we go. So now the only problem is, apart from these minor typing issues due to pandas, is that the date is not defined. And the simplest way to do it here is simply redefine the current date here. So I'm going to take these two lines. There we go. And I'm going to copy them here. And then, of course, I also need to import the datetime. From datetime, import datetime, and then I can also remove this double datetime mention here. So this is the export function. And on the main file, again, delete stuff, which I love doing. So let's delete change dir because that's not needed anymore. And let's also delete the export. Oh, I already did that. Too bad. Okay, now export. We need to import. That sounds really weird. Export, we need to import. Yeah, so it's imported it here. And now obviously it's going to expect the directory. Now it's going to need an extra argument, which is the export dir. So let's add that here. Export dir. There we go. Let's see if this still works. There we go, and it has now created a CSV file with all the information from the analysis. So that still works. That's great. The main file is now much shorter. It basically just contains the constants and the main function. This also means we can remove a lot of these imports because they're no longer needed here. There we go. There's one more thing I'd like to fix before I talk about improving the way that configurations work, and that's doing a slight improvement to how we're logging things in the system. And because what happens at the moment is that when we log something, we always have to write twice the message, once via the logging object and once printing it to the console. And that also means we have to create this extra string, which is a bit inconvenient. So instead of doing this, what I'm going to do is create a log function that we call that does this work for us and put that into a separate module. And part of that module, that should be this, the logging basic config. So let's copy this, and I'm just going to copy that including the date because it's going to need the date. And I'm going to create another file here called log.py where we're going to put this initialization code. Now this doesn't belong here and neither does this. Let's remove the double datetime and let's just import it here. There we go. And now we also need to import the logging module. There, that's the logging module. And then let's add one very simple function here that logs a message. It's not going to return anything, it's simply going to log something. And the only thing that this does is logging.info message, and it prints the message. Now, if we use this log message thing everywhere, instead of doing the double logging, it's going to shorten the code. And also in the future, if you want to change the logging mechanism, there's basically only one place in the code where we need to change it. Let's go back into the main file. And then what we need to do is delete this because that's no longer needed here. And I'm not sure these dates are still needed here. Actually, doesn't seem to be. So I'll also remove these. And then instead of doing this, we can turn this into a very simple function call. Log message, auto import that, and that's going to log this message for us. Let's remove these two print messages. Actually, the quit function here, call here is also not needed because this is the end of the main function, so we don't need to quit. So I can actually also delete that. And while we're at it, this comment is not really useful either. So let's also delete that. There we go. And now that we have the log message function, we can replace all these double calls to logging and replace it with a single function call, which is much cleaner. And I see that I accidentally removed the date here. I shouldn't have done that. So let's just put it back. I'll just take it from this thing here and put it back into the main file for the moment. I'm going to change it anyway later on, but let's just put it here for now. There, that should fix it. And now there is one more issue, is that this is supposed to be an F string, otherwise this doesn't work. And then this import here is also no longer needed. Let's run the code one more time to verify that this still works. And this still seems to work just fine. Now let's think about configuration a bit more. At the moment, all configuration settings are defined right here in the main file, which works, but also it's sometimes quite useful to define these things in another place. And then you can basically run the program with a different configuration without having to change the code, which is useful if you want to share your script with colleagues who don't know Python, but they still want to use your work in some way. Then that's an easier way to do it. So instead of putting them here, what you can do is put them in a separate file, for example, a JSON file. And there are also a couple of packages that really help you with improving the way you deal with configurations like .env or Hydra that I'm going to cover really soon on this channel. But for now, let's keep it very simple and just load configuration settings from a JSON file. That's already something you can do very easily, and it's going to get you started in creating cleaner projects. So what I'll do is add to my example folder here another file called config.json, and this is going to contain all the configuration settings. So I already prepared the basic configuration settings, which is these things, and I basically copied them from the main file. So these are our configuration settings. And then what you can do that's really nice is to use data classes to provide typing information when you're using them in Python. So let's create another file here called config.py, and I'm going to create a data class. So let's import data class as well, and then create a data class here called ScrapeConfig. And this is going to have the main config settings that we have here. So I'll just copy them over so I can rename them. So we have the export dir, and that's going to be a string. We have the prime source, which is also going to be a string. And there's a couple of other things here as well, URLs. So all of these things, they're basically strings. And finally, the paper folder. So that's our configuration. And then let's add a simple function here that's called readConfig. And that's going to get a config file, which is a string. And that's going to return a ScrapeConfig instance. So with open the config file as file, we're going to load the data first using JSON. And let's import JSON. There we go. So that's our data. And then we're going to return a ScrapeConfig instance that gets the data. And then we need to unpack it so that the instance variables are properly set. So this is our readConfig function that's going to help us to read a simple configuration from a JSON file. It's nothing special. It's really simple, but it makes it a lot easier to use the project in the future. So configuration. And then here in the main file, let's read the configuration data. So we're going to have a config object. That's going to be a read config. Let's also import that. And our file is going to be config.json. You could eventually even make it so that the name of the config file is actually something that you pass as a parameter when you call the script, when you execute the script. But here I'm just putting it into the code directly. So that's our config. Let's also add some comment here to explain what this is doing. There we go. And here we're going to fetch data from PDF files and export it. So now what you can do is, instead of using these constants here, like export dir and everything, we can use the configuration instead. So I can just write here config.export dir, and now I can delete this export dir thingy here. Now these things at the moment, the URLs, they're not used. So I will simply delete them for the moment. And this we can also delete actually, because we're reading it from a config. And then let's see, we have here the paper folder. So that one we can also pass from the config. There we go. And then we can remove yet a few other imports as well. So let's run this and verify that this still works. So I think that's the problem with this particular folder. It should actually not have 2 dots, but a single dot. And now it's importing again properly. Now I want to conclude this code roast by looking at a few things to think about when you're dealing with configurations. So the problem is that here we have all the configuration settings available to us, and we can pass them to functions. But in many other places, we don't have that. Like in the JSON scraper, for example, the JSON scraper relies on this particular configuration setting, but we don't have it. So we need a way to pass all this data to the various parts of our application. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. You could store it in a global module somewhere and load the config from that global module, but that introduces a lot of coupling, because if you don't have access to that module, or you want to use, let's say, this class in another setting, you can't really do that. Another way to do it is to pass configuration settings via parameters. And because this is a class, there is actually a pretty simple way to do it. We can add an initializer that allows us to pass things like URLs and etc. as a configuration parameter. So what you could do is something like this, where we have an initializer, and that's going to get in this case, it needs a dimensions URL, which is a string. Obviously, it's going to return none. And then we're going to store it here as an instance variable. And then here we can use that instead, like so. And then whenever we want to use the JSON scraper, we create an instance of it here in the main file, for example, and then we pass it the config that it needs. That's one way of doing it. In the SIO class, actually, this is going to be exactly the same thing, because this needs, for example, this URL, but it also needs the research there. So actually, I can fix this import here right away. So here also you could create an initializer that actually passes these things as a parameter and store it in the instance, and then you can use it here in the scrape method. I won't do it now because this is pretty trivial. You can figure out yourself how to do it, but I'll make sure that I'll put this into the Git repository as well. There's one more thing actually I want to fix in the configuration settings, and that is that at the moment we have these hard-coded word sets here in the PDF scraper, right? The target words and the bycatch words and the research words. And actually it would be much better if these were not defined directly in the code like this, but if they were defined neatly in a couple of separate text files. Now I already created the text files that contain these words. So what we can do now is, instead of defining them in this pdf.py file, is actually load them from the text file. And now that we have a configuration file, we can actually decide which files these are going to be by defining them as a configuration setting. So let's add to our ScrapeConfig class 3 extra instance variables. We have the research words, which is a string. We have the bycatch words, which is also a string. So these are going to be file names, right? And we have the target words, which is also a string containing a file name. And then let's go to our config.json file. And now I've added these 3 settings here in the JSON file as well. So they're in the words folder, and then they're in a particular text file. So that makes it really easy to change from now on. Now the PDF scraper is going to need to know these things, right? So what we can do is, like I did in the JSON scraper, add an initializer where I'm going to load these files. So let's create an initializer here. And this is going to get 3 things: the research words, the bycatch words, and the target words. And then we're going to open the file and store it in the research words instance variable. And let's immediately turn this into a set as well, so that we can do the intersections easily. And let's do the same thing for the other 2. There we go. And now we can remove these constants here. There we go. And then we simply need to replace them here. There we go. So the configuration settings for the PDF scraper are passed here as parameters to the initializer. But now, how do we get these values to the PDF scraper? Where do we need to do it? Well, in the fetch part, we're going to the fetch terms from PDF files. You see that we need to create a PDF scraper there, and then we need to supply the configuration settings. Now, one thing you could do is, instead of creating the PDF scraper inside this function, is to actually inject it as a dependency. It kind of makes sense, because all the other functions like fetch terms from DUI or fetch terms from PubID, they also inject the scraper here. So we could do the same thing for fetch terms from PDF files. The reason to not do it is that this is very specific to PDF files extraction. So perhaps it doesn't make sense to pass anything else than a PDF scraper. And it might also point to perhaps us needing to re-evaluate whether this particular separation into functions makes sense in this way. Maybe we should do it differently. But that's another design discussion that I won't talk about today. For now, what I'm going to do is leave this in here because this is specific to PDF files, but know that you could also inject it as a dependency. And I want to show you one more thing you can do with configuration settings. So here, what we need to do is pass the different Word files to the PDF scraper so that PDF scraper can load them. Now, what you could do is add more arguments here, research words, target words, bycatch words, and then pass them to the PDF scraper. Another thing you could do is that fetch terms from PDF files actually doesn't get a bunch of arguments, but it just gets a scrape config object instead. So let's replace this. Let's see what that looks like. We have a config, which is a scrape config instance. Let's import that here. And then instead of writing paper folder here, we're writing config.paper folder. And then the PDF scraper, well, we can simply pass the parameters here. We have our research words, which is config.research words. We have bycatch words, config.bycatch words, and we have target words. And that's config.target words. If you wanted to, you could also let the PDF scraper initializer accept a scrape config instance instead of these separate parameters, right? It's a design choice. On the one hand, if you pass parameters like this, in this case, the scraper class is highly independent. It doesn't need to know anything about that there exists a scrape config object, but you need to pass more parameters here. On the other hand, in the fetch function, we simply pass a config, which means it's really simple to call this, and it just passes the right information along to the PDF scraper. But now fetch terms from PDF files needs to know that there is something called a scrape config. So depending on the level where you are in the application, you can make a different choice. I'd say on a lower level, where you have lower level objects that are more doing really tiny parts of the work that you need them to do, it's probably not a good idea to pass them high level configuration objects where they may be using one or two parameters of. It's better to make them as independent as possible, simply provide the arguments that they need, and then they're also much easier to test because they're going to be pure functions. In this case, well, this is a very generic function that's going to do a lot of different things with this configuration. It gets the paper folder from it, it gets the different types of Word files from it and pass it to the PDF scraper. So here, I think it's okay that we pass it a scrape config instead of a whole bunch of different arguments. And that's what the configuration object is for, right? To group these things so you can more easily pass them around and more easily have different parts of your application use the configuration. So overall, the way that configuration is now set up is that at the top level in the main file, we decide what the configuration file is, where we're going to read it from. That's going to give us a configuration object. And then we have several mechanisms for passing around the configuration throughout the application. So here, this I should actually remove because this simply requires the configuration. Let's run this code one more time and verify that this still works. And of course it doesn't work because again, I replaced the papers folder with this. That's because that's in my original example. It's structured a bit differently. I should have done that differently. Anyway, now this is working again without a problem. So overall, this is a decent way of dealing with configuration settings. We're reading it from a separate file and we're passing it from the top level. It trickles down to the lower level parts of your application. I've read it from a JSON file here, and I've just used my own config function that basically reads it and converts it into an instance of scrape config. There are better, more generic solutions for this. One very nice package to deal with this that has lots of really useful features is called Hydra, and I'll do a video very soon about Hydra on the channel, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again to John Fallot for supplying the code. I know I was a bit more roasty in this video series, especially related to the scraper initializer, but you know, it's tough love. I just want to help people get better at this stuff because that's what my channel is all about. And I've written down a guide to help you get started with this. It's available for free at arjancodes.com/design guide. And it describes in 7 steps how to design a new piece of software. Basically the things that I go through. These are really actionable points that you can apply directly to your code. So ArjanCodes.com/design guide for your free download. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. If you enjoyed this refactoring, check out this mini-series where I do a full refactoring of a handwritten digit recognition project. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you soon.